Okay, we'll get started. So this week is going to be we're going to work on basically going through and kind of doing a final exam review. Next week we have a guest speaker that'll be coming in from the careers department that's going to kind of go through and talk basically kind of go through and just give some tips and pointers on um the seeking jobs within kind of the fields you'll be looking like seeking jobs kind of within the gaming field and such. It's very interesting. Norm, I've had him speak to the class last couple of years, and it's always a good presentation. He kind of talks a little bit about doing the concept of an elevator speech, just to give a quick introduction and about yourself if you have like 2 minutes to kind of talk to somebody and make an impression. And then he also kind of talks a little bit about just how different things can impact your careers. It normally ends up being a very good discussion. So if you look, you'll see this week we just have in there the final exam review. It's a Word document. You can spend this week working on your final project as well, which the due date is coming up quicker than it seems. So I'm going to switch over to the exam review. So when you take your exam, the exam format will be as follows. There's going to be 25 questions, which actually 26 if you do the extra credit. So 12 of those questions are going to be true false type. 12 of them are going to be multiple choice, meaning you have, A through E, you choose one. And then there's going to be one short answer discussion type question. And then the extra credit is also a short answer discussion question. And it's a little bit longer than the other one, but it's extra credit. So, so the review, if you look the review kind of, I'm just going to scroll through it real quickly. As you see, we've got using some of the Word features. Okay, get out of the way. Zoom, thank you. If I go through and no, that's not the view I wanted. All I want to see is I wanted. So if you go in and you turn on the navigation pane, you'll sit there and you see for all the chapters. If you kind of want to go through and quickly navigate to things, you can get to each chapter through the navigation pane. Or if you want to just go through, look at get to the true false real quick. I've got it set up to kind of make it easier to kind of go through and get through the page if you're familiar with working with the Word navigation. So I'm going to try to do this interactively. So I'm hoping they work. I've got basically for each one, I'm going to go up and I'll put up a quick poll. Like right now, you guys should see a poll that says select true or false for the review question. And look, we're already getting answers. So kind of if you want to go through the first question, the first true false statement from chapter 1 is the first electronic games were played in arcades. So kind of just going through, looking at it. 3 of you said false. 1 said true. The actual answer is false. The first electronic games were actually played in research institutions and on military bases. So we'll end that poll, relaunch it. Yes, clear results. So we've got the next one out there. The term video game came out of the arcade business. So for this one, we've kind of got a 3 saying true, 2 saying false. And actually the answer to this one is true. And again, this comes from the same area of chapter 1 that the first question came from. And it's basically a straight statement that Yeah, the video games came out of the arcade business. So we'll. Next one, Sega Enterprises released the first Japanese export arcade game, Periscope. So again, we'll just let everybody kind of answer a little bit if you want. So everybody answered true, and that is the case. So the last true false for the and again, this format that I have here, excuse me, you two. Sorry, go. Hold on one second. I'm kicking my dogs out of here.
Let's go. Out.
Sorry about that. So the next one, as you can see, is the ESRB was created by the government to provide parents and consumers with the information on game content. And everybody said false. And the ESRB was created by the industry to keep the government from creating something probably worse. So with that, I'm going to switch, and I've got kind of a generic multiple choice. So now this is kind of, and as you notice, all the questions for each of the chapters are going to be the same one. We've got, what is there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 true, false, and there should be 5 multiple choice from each chapter in the review. So in this one, the statement is before video games were introduced into amusement arcades, blank games were the most popular. And you have claw cranes, foosball, billiards, air hockey, or pinball. So I'm going to kind of share the results on this one because, as you see, 4 of you picked answer E, which is correct. Pinball was the most popular game in the arcades. So that was just it. Again, this is stuff straight out of chapter 1. So this one can be a little bit tricky. Which of the following companies has never owned Atari? And again, this is straight out of the chapter, and I can actually give you, if I look real quick, I will give you. So this comes off page 7 in the book, and there's a little section called Atari's Little Ride, that wild ride that kind of talks about all that. And so believe it or not, the answer for this one is actually D, Commodore. And when you sit there and you look in that little section, the Atari's Wild Ride, it goes through and it talks about all the different companies that owned Atari throughout the history of the company. Over there. So, which of the following arcade games incorporated rough three-act plot structure featuring animated sequences, a precursor to today's cinematics? Yep, and everybody got that right. It was Ms. Pac-Man. And why do you want to put that up in the middle? Mario Brothers was the third game in what was to become the Mario franchise. What was the second game called? And again, this is out of chapter 1, talking about the history of games. So the answer is A, Donkey Kong Jr. You had Donkey Kong, then Donkey Kong Jr. Mario was actually in both of those as the plumber trying to rescue, as the little plumber trying to rescue the princess from the evil ape. And we're going to go and put that in front of the screen again. So the last chapter 1 multiple choice question, that type of question.
Wait, hold on. Before you, which one was it again?
It was A, Donkey Kong Jr. So the last question for chapter 1 is the first Easter egg, which was hidden in adventure by Warren Robinette, consisted of A, an encrypted message, B, his credit, C, a secret level, D, a new character, E, unlimited power. So for this one, the answer is B. It was his credit. He put the concept of an Easter egg of his credit. So those are kind of the very good examples of what the type of questions that you'll see on the final for the trues and the false for coming out of chapter 1. They pretty much cover all the different little areas that are in the chapter. And the final is kind of all based off the stuff from the book. Moving to chapter 2. So the first question, so back to true false format. It's going to jump them away. So arcade games gave birth to the action genre. And everybody got that one right. That is true. Get out of the way. Console systems have traditionally been multi-purpose devices. So for this, the answer is false. The console systems are traditionally, like when you're talking about a multi-purpose device, you're talking more like a PC that may have other uses besides. And again, the key on this question that makes it false is traditionally, because when you sit there and you look today's modern console systems, yeah, they are multi-purpose device. But when you look back at the consoles, the consoles were single purpose playing games, and it wasn't until we started getting into some of the more modern modern games where you were able to do more than just play games on it. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to say exactly what you did, because like consoles today are multi-purpose devices, but back then gaming was all they were good for.
Yeah.
What would have been the first multi-purpose console, by the way? Or at least the first successful one anyway.
The later generations, like take your pick, the later generations of the Xbox and the PlayStations, I believe. I mean, depending on what you consider multi-purpose, the PlayStation 2 was kind of multi-purpose because when they introduced the DVD drive, you were able to not only play games on it, but if you had DVDs, you could watch DVDs on it.
I think that would count, because a lot of people who did buy PS2s at the time bought them as cheaper DVD players and immediately rendered DVD players obsolete.
Yep. So the next question is, or true false is, the computer platform is a proprietary system.
I can't see the poll.
Oh, sorry. I gotta. There we go. So going through, everybody chose false on this one, and that is correct. Obviously, a computer is proprietary, meaning like where you sit there and you look at all the hardware. You can have multi different vendors and everything. So it's not proprietary. It's not set up to be a single thing. The mobile market of smartphones and tablets has threatened single-purpose handhelds. So looking through, and so that one is obviously true. A lot of the stuff that you can do on single-purpose handhelds, you can do on a smartphone, especially the more modern smartphones and tablets. You can play the same games. A lot of them have the same games available. And then the last true/false for this chapter is the tabletop platform is often used by game developers to create prototypes of electronic games. And everybody answered true for that one, which is correct. That is the case. Remember, when referring to the tabletop platform, we're not talking about like the old school video games where the monitor was built into a table, like what you used to see. It's funny seeing the retro style Pizza Hut commercials where they're showing off him playing the video games at the old style Pizza Huts. But tabletop platform is your analog version of the game. So like, your Risk, Monopolies, your board games.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
I had more RPGs in my head, but I lost some, so sorry.
And we'll switch now to the multiple choice. So I'm going to move up a little bit. So by acting as an overlay or an extension of the game being played on a television screen, the Wii U controller is conducive to playing blank games. And E, augmented reality, is the correct choice. On that, and I'm looking for where it talks about that. It's going to be somewhere in the console section. Oh, there's a little subsection about the Wii U in the chat on page 41 that kind of goes into more details about it. So games that let me relaunch. It's going to pop over here. Games that allow for a great deal of reflective thought usually have a blank time interval. Okay. Yep. And the answer for that is C, turn-based. A lot of times when you sit there and you look, your turn-based games are your chess, checkers, things like that, and where you can allow for reflective thought. Boom, boom. Double Dragon was the first blank arcade game that incorporated a blank interval. So this first answer is the first blank. The second answer is the second blank. So for this one, the answer, and I do have the results here, the answer is actually A. Double Dragon was a two-player arcade game, and it was a two-player real-time game where it was the first one that two players played at the same time, and it was a real-time cooperative, but not cooperative. I forget there was a term they used, but it was where you're playing together, but you're playing against each other type game. So let me move up. Gauntlet was an early blank arcade game with 4 joysticks that involved up to four simultaneous players. Man, my mouth is working well. So far we've got 2. There we go. We got more answers coming in. So the answer is, I went too far. So the answer is D. It was a local co-op multiplayer game. Continue, get out of the way. And then the last of the multiple choice examples for chapter 2. The traditional massively multiplayer MMO player mode involves blank. Forming cooperative teams to defeat non-player characters, competing against each other without forming teams, forming cooperative teams to defeat other player teams, cooperating and competing with one another, competing against non-player characters without forming teams. Okay, so the answer for that is wrong button, is A. Again, this is one that you might want to focus on traditional, because there may be more current massively multiplayer games online that don't have that focus. That may be a combination of all of them, but traditionally, as in when the game started, it was more of this. No. Poll. Thank you. There we go. So moving on to the chapter 3, social questions, true false questions. Social games have played a part in redefining casual as distinct from frequency of play. And the answer for that is true. This is right in the beginning of chapter 3. So the action adventure genre is the only hybrid that distinguished itself as an accepted genre as an accepted genre in its own right. And the answer for this one is also true. Action adventure was like the first hybrid genre that came out to fit its own. Puzzle games traditionally involve 2 or more players. So the answer for this is false. Puzzle games traditionally involve 1 player. Some vehicle simulation games have been adapted for use by the military for training purposes. And the answer to this one is true. Yeah.
Oh, do you have something to say?
No, I saw your hand. Sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, because speaking of vehicle simulation games, I'm actually like, have any of you guys else have heard of like this prototype game called the Bradley Trainer, which was based on Battlezone? It was a full-on vehicle simulator that has you as a Bradley gunner. Was intended for training Bradley gunners in the military.
I haven't heard of it, but
It's a pretty interesting story, but it never made it past the prototype phase.
yeah, I do know the main customer that my company supports for a period. I don't know if they still are, but at one point they were working on using Unity to go through and build some of the simulations that they use for certain training purposes and stuff like that to gamify some of the simulations that they used more. The last true false is sandbox games never have goals. So, and the answer for that is false. So one thing, kind of just looking at test taking 101, when you see an absolute statement like never or always on a true or false question, if you can think of one scenario that invalidates it, then that means false or true. So moving to the multiple choice. Games created for non-entertainment purposes are known as, and I got to move down because E is on the next page. Games for good, serious games, advert games, social games, or games for health. And the answer for this is B, serious games. And if you're looking for reference in the book, there's a little subsection under educational games on page 61 that talks about serious games. And it basically says serious games are games created for non-entertainment purposes are also known as serious games. They're used by business, medicine, education, and the government to educate, inform, recruit, persuade, or market to players. And it goes on a little bit more description of it. So elements such as discussion threads in online classrooms do not involve, I'm not even going to say that first word, try to say that word because my tongue won't work on it. Constructivism, lateral learning, creative expression, social interaction, and oh wow, pedagogy. We ended up having an F on this and I don't have F as a choice. And B is the correct answer, constructivism. And I'm looking for exact reference to that. I missed where it has. I'll have to look to see if I can find the exact reference for with that question. So through its Bimani division, Blank launched a series of games where players perform in some way to create music or rhythm patterns. So the answer on that is actually A. And that's from, if you're looking in chapter 3, it's page 69. There's a little subsection on music and rhythm games. And actually the first line of it is through its Bimani music video game division, Japan's Konami launched a series of games where players in some way by either dancing, singing, or playing instrument style controllers to create music or rhythm patterns. So games that depend on detailed storylines, such as those in the traditional adventure genre, have been known to suffer from blank issues. Character development, point of view, balance, replayability, or cinematic. And look at Word Grammar Check giving you the answer. So the answer on that one is D, replayability. Sometimes a lot of games like the traditional adventure where you're playing through a story, you get to the end, you finish playing the story, and if you're not that interested in playing the story again, and the last multiple choice sample from this chapter is traditional blank games have little or no character development. Adventure, strategy, action adventure, survival horror, or role playing. So the answer on that one is B, traditional strategy games. So now we'll move on to chapter 4. So the first true false. So moving into chapter 4, now we're moving into why players play. The first question is more than half of first true false is more than half of Americans play electronic games. True or false? And the answer is true on that. And it's probably even more true now. The Myers-Briggs type indicator model to measure personality types is based on the work of Dr. Sigmund Freud. And I'm looking to see where. So the answer for that is indeed false. And I'm looking for the reference in the chapter to where it's in the psychographics section. I know that page 102, where it talks about the Myers-Briggs type indicators. And it's actually based off of the works of Jung. Adult women make up a larger percentage of players than boys aged 6 to 17. And again, this is a stat based off of when the book was written and not possibly current times. So the answer on that is true, and I'm looking to see where it would be. It's the it's in the section starting on page 104 about the demographics. So those, I keep forgetting to. So in this chapter, they had the two, I think it was a page or 2 pages of the Millennial Trends Quiz. And basically there's a statement about the results of that. It says those who do poorly on the Millennial Trends Quiz could be influenced by the media, which currently focuses more on reporting news related to teenagers. So the Millennial Trends Quiz is on page 109, and the question, and basically the statements about the results of the Millennials Trends Quiz is on page 110. But the answer to that is true. Unlike the film's ratings established by the Motion Pictures Association of America, the MPAA, ESRB ratings are not tied to the age group of the target market. So the answer to that is false. If you look at the ESRB ratings are early childhood, everyone 10 plus, teen, mature 17 plus, adults only, and of course the very popular rating pending. So moving on to the multiple choice. Richard Bartle's Spades player suit corresponds to players who enjoy, and this is on the very first page of the chapter. The answers are interacting with non-player characters, interacting with the game environment, manipulating the game environment, and manipulating other players, interacting with other players. So for the answer to this one, it is C. The spades are considered the explorers, and they're the ones who like to manipulate the game world, as opposed to diamonds, since the other most popular answer was B. The diamonds are the ones who like interacting with the game world because they're the achievers. Blank analysis assumes that people's beliefs change over time and demographic, cohort, life stage, psychographic, or generational. So the answer to this one is E, generational. And this goes into the whole into the section talking about the demographics of generation, starting on page 106. Players who are primarily motivated by blank focus on asserting their status in a game by attaining high scores and rankings. A, escapism, B, addiction, C, mastery, D, social interaction, or E, knowledge. And I see everybody's answering C, which is the correct answer, mastery. So we don't need to. The online game market in blank is the highest developed in the world. And again, this may have changed, I'm not sure, but at the time of the book, this was the accurate. The answers are Germany, China, South Korea, United Kingdom, and Japan. So actually, the answer to this one is C, because at the time the book was written, South Korea had the highest developed online game market because they had the highest percentage of high-speed internet available at the time. Although blank boasts a growing market for massively multiplayer online RPGs and online casual games, its console market is non-existent. So the answer for this one is B, China. And on page 99 of the text, it goes through and talks about the gaming market in China at the time. So now we switch over into the second section, starting with chapter 5, which now we're moving from kind of the history and all the outside stuff that kind of goes into the game environment and stuff like that, like the elements, to now where we start talking about the content So again, going to true, false, and pulling. So the first true, false from chapter 5 is it's much easier to form a mental image of the protagonist when viewing a film or playing a game in first person point of view. And the answer to this is false. On in page 128, or I'm sorry, 129 and 130, it talks about the protagonist, and it goes into all the different things why this is false. Get out of the way. The shadow archetype often represents the antagonist character in a story. So this one is true, and that's almost literally word for word in the word for word the first or the second sentence of the definition of the antagonist from the text on page 130. In the Hollywood 3-act structure, Act 2 introduces the main character's problem and obstacles that stand in the character's way. So this one is actually false. The Act 2, or in the Hollywood 3-act structure, which is broken down on page 133, the Act 2, or the middle of the story, focuses on the obstacles that stand in the way of the character's ability to solve the problem introduced in Act 1. And there's usually a series of obstacles in Act 2 that the character must overcome. The act compromises a bulk of the dramatic tension in the story. So the key on this one is the problem is introduced in Act 1 and the obstacles are Act 2. And that's why this statement is false. Continue. Games involving lone nomadic heroes such as The Legend of Zelda, Tomb Raider, Half-Life, and Metal Gear Solid are particularly appealing to the millennial generation. So this is false, and I'm looking for the reference in the chapter to be able to. I have to look to see why that's. Okay, it's got to be up in the beginning of the chapter. I'll have to look to see where that comes from. So the last true false, the machinima is a game engine. And the answer for that is true. That's from page 157 of the book, where it talks about machine enema, or the blending of machine and cinema. So moving to the multiple choices. Psychologist Dr. Carl Jung explains Dr. Carl Jung explains the reason for storytelling in terms of blank: the hero's journey, the monomyth, the hierarchy of needs, collective unconsciousness, or Hollywood three-act structure. So the correct answer for that is D, collective and unconscious. And I'm looking again for the reference to be able to. Have to look to get that. I'm going to try to see if I can get the page references for some of these to be able to sit there. I don't want to take like all the time while I'm sitting here looking through the book. In The Writer's Journey, Christopher Vogler applied blank hero's journey to screenwriting. Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, George Lucas, Abraham Maslow, or Joseph Campbell. So the answer for that one is Joseph Campbell, and that's actually written. It's on page 133 or 134 and 135, where we talk about the book talks about the monomyth and hero's journey. An interesting effect known as blank interaction can occur when an audience becomes so attached to characters that they actually believe the characters are real people. And the answer to that is C, parasocial interaction. And that's from page 141. There's a little block that talks about the parasocial interaction within games and stories. When applying the social hierarchy of need based on Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs model to character development, the protagonist bonds with another character in a one-on-one relationship in the blank level. So this one is the answer for this one is C, interpersonal. And I'm looking to where it relates it to 164 is where it defines the character levels, and I'm looking to see where it relates it to hierarchy of needs. Um, and this may be another one that's okay. So I have to look to see if I can get the reference for that, get a better reference for that. And the last what question for this is using the blank technique, an animator creates each pose of movement and generates animation files. Motion capture, sprite, motion sensing, keyframing, and I got to give you the way to answer. Keyframing or rotoscoping. And this is at the very end of the chapter in talking about how characters are made. So the answer is D, keyframing. And this is from, they talk about the keyframing technique on page 170 of the book.
One sec.
Anyone else's hands hurt?
Oh, we're halfway through. We're almost halfway through. So again, just as a reminder too, as I'm going through, the document I have is available to you here to be able to go through and review. And it's good that you're taking copious notes, Jarrett, because I don't know if I've said this before, but this exam review, if you can go through and do this exam review and do well with answering majority of the questions, you will have zero problems with the final. So moving on, player to game interactivity involves the way players interact with the environment rather than with each other. And that's from page, the answer is true, and it's from page 188 of the chapter. Reiner Knizia's Lord of the Rings board game is considered to be a zero-sum game. So this is a direct example in the chapter. And the answer for this is actually false. It is actually a non-zero sum game. And that is from page 192. An implicit challenge is intentional and immediate, such as determining the exact timing required to jump over an obstacle in a platformer. And this is actually false. Implicit. Talking on starting on page 196, it talks about implicit and explicit challenges. Card games such as poker provide perfect information to players. And relaunching, continue. And everybody's got it. False is correct, is the correct answer. Poker provides imperfect. And again, this is also from page 196. And then games such as Minecraft that encourage players to utilize resources based on real world rules make excellent use of extrinsic knowledge.
Can you repeat that?
Games such as Minecraft that encourage players to utilize resources based on real world rules make excellent use of extrinsic knowledge. And this is true. This is from page 198. Intrinsic knowledge is knowledge you gain from within the game. Extrinsic knowledge is knowledge you gain from outside the game. So, for example, knowledge that wood floats in water would be extrinsic knowledge. Knowledge of the layout of a level within a game, that would be intrinsic knowledge. Moving to the multiple choices. Games such as dodgeball and tag-in, which two or more players gang up on one player, utilize blank competition, cooperative, unilateral, zero-sum, non-zero-sum, multilateral. And then this goes back to the beginning of the chapter. On this is unilateral, and this is from page 189 in the chapter where it talks player-to-player competition. So the answer on that would the answer for this one is B, unilateral, and it's from page 189 where it talks about player-to-player competition. Engaging in a tit-for-tat strategy in a prisoner's dilemma scenario where one player betrays the other on the first turn most often results in a blank outcome. And A is defeat, B is temptation, C is tit for two tats, D is reward, and E is punishment. So the answer for this is C, a tit for two tats. And the prisoner's dilemma is on pages 193 and 194. And this specific example is towards the end of that on 194. The tragedy of the commons is a social trap in which a number of people make blank decisions that lead to an, since we're trying to be correct for grammar, result. So it's where they make individual decisions to lead to a collective result, rational decisions to lead to an irrational result, rational decisions that lead to rational results, irrational decisions that lead to irrational results, or irrational decisions that lead to collective results. Oh, did I restart? I don't think I relaunched. So the answer for this one is actually C. Rational decisions that lead to a rational result. And the tragedy of the commons is on page 194 and 195, where it talks about why it is so. It defines why that answer is true. Character advancement in a game is most closely related to the blank relationship concept. A, dynamic, B, symmetry, C, transitive, D, static, and E, intransitive. So the answer for this is C, transitive. And this is where it talks about, in the section of the chapter where it talks about balance and strategies, in particularly on page 204 and 205, where it talks about the transitive and intransitive relationships, and it defines all this. Oops, wrong type. So moving on to the next chapter. So now we've kind of we're moving into.
Actually, I don't think we went over the last one. Players can interact with blank balance through destruction, maintenance.
That was the last one, through transitive balance.
Then what was the one before that?
Oh, okay. Sorry. So the one before it is transitive. Players can, thank you. I forgot both those have very similar answers. So players can interact with blank balance through destruction, maintenance, or restoration. This is also in the same section of the chapter. And in particular on page 207 is where it talks about it, and it's the answer is A, dynamic. Oh, I did it again. So moving on to chapter 7, where we're talking about building the world now. One universal rule seems to be that a player must complete at least one level in any game in a single session. So the answer, that is true, and that's in the first section of the chapter, starting on 2, but where it talks about level design and flow, and I'm looking to, and I believe it's right on page 214 where it goes into that. The next true false is the S-curve progression model is a hybrid of the flat and linear models. And everybody got that? That is true. This is from page 217 where it talks of progression, and it talks about, in particular, it shows the S-curve, the linear, and the flat. Games using an aerial perspective are considered God or toy games. So now we're moving into perspective. And that, oh, did I? So this one is actually false. On page 224, it talks about aerial or top-down games, and it actually aerial, or it calls it the top-down perspective. So a height map is a contour picture depicting the elevations of intersection points on a 2D grid. And normal mapping. I'm looking to see exactly what it talks about. Looking to see where it goes into height map. So on page 224, in 224, where it talks about where it's talking about the isometric perspective, it talks about at the bottom of it, it talks about a height map, and a height map is a contour picture depicting the elevations of intersecting points on a 3D grid. And what makes this question false is because it says on a 2D grid. And the last true false, cell shading is the art of rendering objects to look photorealistic. This is, the answer for this is false, and I'm looking for the reference again on it. So there's a little box on 231 that goes into specifically cell shading. It says it's the art of rendering objects to look like hand-drawn cartoons as opposed to being photorealistic. Moving to multiple choice. Multiple choice in level structure elements of blank include ensuring that a player stays in a particular area of a level until necessary tasks have been accomplished, or preventing a player from returning to a particular area once the objectives associated with that area have been met. Elements of A, progression, B, relationship, C, availability, D, duration, or E, flow.
I can't see the panel.
So the answer for this is E, flow. And it talks about this in the level design section, and particularly page 215. In traditional strategy games, a blank is used to describe a series or set of levels that need to be completed in order to finish the game. A mission, a scenario, a campaign, a chapter, or a cinematic. Okay, everybody got that right. That is C, campaign is correct. What type of progression model would work best in a traditional role-playing game? A, S-curve, B, spiral, C, bell curve, D, flat, or E, linear? So the answer for this one is E, linear. And again, this is on page 217, where the chapter talks about progression. Time speeds up when characters go to sleep in The Sims, which means that the game exhibits blank time. A, player adjusted, B, variable, C, altered, D, authentic, E, limited. So the answer on this one is C, altered. And where's, so the section on time starts on page 220, and on page 222 is where it talks about altered time in particular. The blank perspective is often considered pseudo 3D, side-scrolling, top-down, aerial, isometric, or omnipresent. So the answer for this is D, which is isometric, and this is in the section on your views, and in particular isometric, or your space, and in particular isometric is defined on page 224. Oh, dang it. So moving on to chapter 8. now we're working on talking about the interface information. So stereoscopy allows for a comfortable 3D effect by not requiring the viewer to wear glasses or goggles to combine the images. So the answer for this is actually false. And this information is on page 251, where it talks about the Auto 3DS, and it stereoscopy is where you require the glasses to be able to see the 3D. Disney has been a vigorous proponent of replacing lives with tries in many of its games. And the answer to this is true. And that's in the section talking about it's on 253 and 254, where it talks about lives and power. And particularly on 254, it talks about Disney's information with it. In a direct control interface, the player clicks somewhere on the screen, causing the player's avatar to move to that location. True or false? So this answer, I didn't relaunch, did I? Sorry about that. Direct control interface, player clicks somewhere on the screen, causing the player's avatar to move to that location. True or false? So the answer for this is actually false, and I'm looking for the exact spot where the reference is. And of course it's not. Control character. I'll have to get the reference for that, to give the exact reference of where it talks about that, because we are rapidly running out of time. The main idea behind designing for usability is to think more like an artist than an engineer. True or false? So that is false. It's the main primary purpose of user interface is functionality, not aesthetics, in dealing with usability. And then finally, Games that are internationalized require multiple translations. So that is actually false, and that is covered on page 267 in a section about internationalization. So moving on to the multiple choice. The blank interface usually focuses on a player control rather than feedback. Heads up display, active, wrapper, passive, or status. And the answer to this is B, active, and active interfaces discussed on page 247. The Wii, Connect, and Move are examples of systems that utilize blank technology: auto stereoscopic, augmented reality, 3D, motion capture, or motion sensing. So the answer for this is E, motion sensing, and this is on page 244. The Nintendo 3DS screen is capable of movement blank, where the movement of a scene changes with the movement of the head. Movement A, mapping, B, depth, C, 3D, D, parallax, E, stereoscopy. And the answer is D, parallax. And this is again on 261 in the talk about the 3DS. Players with blank disabilities might have tinnitus, which should be addressed by game accessibility, cognitive, audio, visual, motor, and speech. And the answer is B, audio, and this is on, in particular, page 265 is where it talks about audio disability, designing for audio disabilities. The blank option, also known as checkpoint save, offers the most immersion and least amount of player control. The continuous save option, auto save option, save to slot option, quick save option, or save to file option. So the answer for that is B, autosave, and 271 and 272 talk about all the save options and how they work. So I'm going to go through chapter 9 as well, if you guys don't mind staying for a few minutes past 8:30. And then the last 3 chapters, hopefully next week we'll have a little bit of time to go over. But what I'm going to do is I'll also go through and try to add into this document references to where you can find the answers. If that way, if we don't have time to go through. So the first one, we're into the audio section. Game voiceover sessions are usually recorded out of context and involve alternate lines of dialogue. And the answer to this is true. And on 290, 291, 290 and 291, there's a whole section about voiceovers. Looping music can provide ambience, allowing for more immersive experience than adaptive music. And this is false. Adaptive music is actually the one that applies more immersive. And when you're looking at the music, adaptive versus looping, 292 to 297 is the whole section on music, in particular, those 2 types. A game score consists primarily of songs. And this is false, and this is also in that same section on music, and talks about game scores on page 298 and 299. Musician and composer Peter Drescher suggests that cloud-based audio is a viable solution to the problem of mobile audio bandwidth limitations. And specific to where so this is true, and this is from page 296. There's actually a whole section, little section on mobile game audio in the cloud. And the last true false for this chapter, the game composing process also often begins with a spotting session. And again, this is in this music. It's the answer to this is false, and this is in the music section from 292 to 298. Continue. Early computer-based games of the 1980s involved A, MIDI. Early computer-based games audio in the 1980s involved A, MIDI, B, FM synthesis, C, mod, D, tracked audio, or E, Foley. So the answer to this is B, FM synthesis, and it is on page 280 where it talks about. Blank sounds are created in a studio rather than in a field. A, MIDI, B, FM synthesis, C, mod, D, tracked audio, or E, Foley. And the answer is E, Foley. And there's a whole section on Foley that is starts on page. I just saw the section on Foley. It's in the beginning of the chapter. So it talks about Foley. Basically, it talks about in the sound effects section from 285 to 287. Blank can be thought of as networking protocol that specifies how musical notes are stored and transmitted and often incorporates several different devices that work together to create sound. A, MIDI, B, FM synthesis, C, mod, D, tracked audio, or E, Foley.
The thing again.
Oh, sorry. So the answer for this is A, MIDI. And MIDI is, yeah, that's, I mean, there's things you can do with MIDI tracks that are very interesting. In 280, 281 in particular, it talks about MIDI, but 282 to 283 is where it talks about all those concepts. Dolby True HD, utilized in the PS3, is an advanced blank compression that provides an exact duplicate of the original audio stream. A, lossless, B, DLS1, C, lossy, D, sampled, E, DLS2. And so A is correct, and that's lossless. And then that's in that same section. And the last one for this section, and then I'll kind of go through and we'll see if we can get 10, 11, and 12, but those are more recent. So hopefully we should be more fresh. A composer is often brought into a film or game project during the blank phase. A, pre-production, B, concept, C, production, D, prototype, E, post-production. And the answer to this is E, post-production. And again, this is in that last section on music that starts on page 292, I believe, 292, and goes basically through the end of the chapter. So we're going to kind of leave off the review here because we're past time for class. We've got chapter 10, 11, and 12 that's in there. What I'm going to try to do is go through and update this document to kind of give you better references to where in the chapter to find all these information. Again, if you can go through and have all the answers to all this, you should have no issues with being able to take the final and pass the final easily. So Anybody have any other questions? Like I said, I'm going to go through and I'm going to try to add in references to this for the most part, going through looking at the polls. A majority of the questions you guys got right. Remember, there are 10 questions for each chapter, which means that this document has 120 questions in it. Out of those 120 questions, you are going to get 24. So I wouldn't sit there and look at this document and go, oh my God, I got to know all these. It's going to be a random, it'll be similar to this, and it's going to be 120, it'll be 24 questions similar to this, 12 true, false, 12 multiple choice. And then the short answer question, just to kind of switch to that, these are the short answer questions. Some of them are, what is usability and why is it important to game development? What is machine anima? How is it created? What is prosumerism and how is modding an example of it? What are 5 types of disabilities that need to be addressed when making a game interface compliant with accessibility requirements? What are the 3 phases of iterative design and why is the process important in game development? Discuss 3 reasons why game audio is important. Why is it more difficult to be a voice actor in a game opposed to other media, film, television? What's the difference between looping and adaptive audio? What's the difference between passive and active visual interface? And what's the difference between game art and design? So again, you're going to have one question that is similar to these. And then this is an example of, if you're sitting there and you're looking for an example of something that as the extra credit is going to look very similar to this. And this is something that they talk that is discussed in the history chapter. To give you a hint. Like I said, if you can go through and have all these questions with their answers, you will and use that as your study guide, you should have no issues with this final exam. And remember, the final exam is online. So, any questions, comments? All right. Sorry I kept you guys a little bit longer. I took a little bit longer going through some of the going through the questions. I'm going to go through and I'm going to try to put references to where everything is in the chapters, page references. So that way it makes it a little bit easier to kind of find the correct answer. And then we'll go from there. Next week, we have our guest speaker. And at some point after that, the final will get turned on and I will send an email out kind of giving you more direction about like rules for with the final, which are basically similar to what the rules are for your quizzes. Plus you'll have something else as a reference. So with that, have a good night. Have a good week. Don't stress over this. It's not worth stressing over it. Trust me, when you see the final, you'll realize it.
When does this open up, by the way?
Huh? I'm sorry?
When does the final open up?
It will open up after we're done next week.
Thanks. Cool.
And there should be no, I'll have to double check on it. There should be no time limit on it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor.
Yep. Jarrett, don't stress about it. It's going to be a lot easier than you're thinking.
Oh, I'm thinking it's easy.
Okay.
It's just the problem is I'm really bad at scheduling. That's my issue.
Yeah. No, it will open up after we're done with class next week.
Does it look like I'm stressing out? Like
Yeah.
it's really, I think it's just more the pain of like all that writing I had to do, speaking more than express.
Okay. Well, have a good week, guys. Share. Oh, my buttons moved.